Welcome back after lunch, everybody, and welcome to those of you who have joined the conference now. I don't think I need to say that this is an event organized by Sandra and myself on behalf of both our university, which has not been mentioned so far, the University of Bath, and the Center for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing. So I am Adalgisa Giorgio from Bath, and I'm also a member of the steering committee of the center. I am going to chair this meeting, this session, which is our first keynote for the conference. And our keynote speaker today is Dr. Serena Todesco. Dr. Todesco holds an MA in Comparative Literature and Cultural Studies from the University of Limerick, Ireland, from 2008, and a PhD in Italian Literature from University College Cork in 2013. She also has qualifications in translation, and she is a literary translator and an independent scholar of Italian literature and gender studies. Her research interests include female identity and self-subjectification in relation to gendered and/or cultural otherness in the South, and the relationships between philosophies of sexual difference, motherhood, and women's literature in contemporary Italy. She has authored a few books: the monograph Tracce a margine, Women's Writing on the Memory of Women in Literature in the work of Sicilian women writers of the 1990s and the 2000s, and also of a book-long interview with or conversation with a feminist activist and author, Maria Rosa Cutrufelli. The book is entitled Campo a Due, Dialogo con Maria Rosa Cutrufelli, and the conversation between an older feminist activist and a younger one centers around women's writing, feminism, and gender culture in Italy. She has also co-edited very recently two online special issues of journals with co-edited, and one of them is again about Sicily and women's writing, but going back from now until back to the 15th century. And the second special issue of the journal of a South African journal is about the representation of terror, the supernatural, science fiction, utopia, and dystopia in women's writing. She's also published extensively on women writers, especially in relation to gendered thematizations of the South and motherhood and daughterhood. So you can read the her complete bio in our document online. Before giving the floor to Serena, I would like to add to what I said this morning about how this conference came about, that our original keynote for the conference of 2020, which didn't happen, was going to be on Elena Ferrante. However, after 2020, it became apparent that a new literary trend had been developing and emerging in Italy, and therefore we changed the topic of the keynote. Serena will be looking at these new trends, or this trend, which concerns writers born in the late 70s and early 80s in Italy. Serena will ask whether and how the Ferrante effect has affected writers and not just readers, and whether it has been at least partially responsible for an increasingly large presence of classic topics of Italian feminism in contemporary narrative by authors who did not experience feminism firsthand, and also on the impact of certain aspect of today's culture on this writing. Okay, so the title of Serena's paper today, or keynote speech, is A Ferrantean Legacy, Contemporary Italian Women's Narratives, or How to Turn Literary Feminism into Pleasure. And Serena will speak for about 50 minutes, and then we will have the Q&A session. And as with the other sessions early on today, you can ask questions either in the chat or live by raising a digital hand or waving at us. Again, if you wish to remain anonymous, you can send me your question privately on the chat. And if you do not want to be recorded, you have to turn yourself off, turn your camera off, and you will not be recorded. And again, you can ask your question anonymously in the chat. Okay, I think I've covered everything. Sandra, have I covered everything? So Serena, over to you. We're really looking forward to hearing you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I just started my time. Yes, I will be speaking between 45, 47 minutes. Thank you so much. This is really a great honor and a privilege to be here. Thanks to the Center for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing and Professors Adalgisa Giorgio and Sandra Darotsky and the wonderful people I've been meeting and listening to so far. And thank you for the over-generous presentation to Adalgisa, who's been nurturing my research well before the beginning of my latest phase of my interest in women's writing. So I just share my screen with you and hope it's okay. If you have any problem, if you can't see, just give me heads up. Okay. When I was 18 years old, reading changed my life. In the late 90s, I listened to a radio program called Damasco, referring to the city where, as the Bible has it, St. Paul was first struck by Christian faith. By drawing a parallel between St. Paul's transformation and discovery faith in the divine and encounter with books that change lives, each episode featured a celebrity from the cultural world who described how certain books had transformed their existence. And I realized that as a very young reader of feminist literature, I could change the way the books I loved were shaping my existence, not consistent with that shown by the falsely universal perspective of canonical male narratives. One thing that literature has taught me is the incredible potential of women's writing during moments of social transformation, and how the practices of reading and writing can expand the positive effects of those changes. I agree with Professor Jill Rye when in 2001 she observed, "I write and read with the understanding that cultural production contributes to change and that socio-political change and changes in perception of identity are interdependent." One recent example of this transformative potential of literature and readership, of course, is the global success of Elena Ferrante, whose universe of stories have affected the expectations and the desires of millions of readers all over the world. Stories of female marginalization, violence, trauma, and rebirth have inspired new forms of feminist engagement and reading against the grain of patriarchal traditions. Plus, they have provoked the process of physiological and cognitive changes, which, according to Victor Nell, result from the pure pleasure of letting oneself become involved in extensive reading activities. Numerous topics have finally come out of the closet of radical feminism, as well as revealing their applicability to a vast quantity of female authors from remote and recent past: motherhood and daughterhood, abortion, sexual violence, equality struggles, and gender discrimination, female creativity, bodily desires, and sexuality. Ferrante made millions of readers aware that issues that have historically been part of feminist struggles can be a source of painful yet necessary creative changes. In her writings, Ferrante has reestablished bonds with feminist philosophers such as Luisa Muraro and Adriana Cavarero, as well as with other Italian and international writers. Not only has she reclaimed as her foremothers such Italian authors as Elsa Morante, Fabrizia Ramondino, and Anna Maria Ortese, promoting their discovery or rediscovery outside national borders, she has also established dialogues with such international authors as Ingeborg Bachmann, Christa Wolf, Clarice Lispector. This has reminded us that no feminist is an island. These are all good reasons to make us literary specialists love Ferrante. However, her plots have charmed a heterogeneous public who does not necessarily possess the intellectual and cultural tools to see all sorts of symbolic and political layers identified by scholarly readership. She has been read for pleasure, becoming a real addiction for millions of people who read her on the beach or at the hairdresser. So why have many liked Ferrante's books, given them as gifts, or watched TV series and films inspired by her stories? Ferrante's stories inspired pleasure precisely because as women, we have finally felt a number of taboos were being broken. In them, we have read about realities that we often experience ourselves. Our reality hunger, and I'm quoting David Shield's definition here, has been satisfied. Once we have consumed their books, the perceptions of many among us, both as readers and as individuals in a world of patriarchal backlashes, have been deeply transformed. With millions of female as well as male readers all over the world, and dozens of translations, conference panels, and roundtables, scholarly research and debates, we can say that Ferrante's impact on a global spread of popular feminist literature, while influencing many different cultures and contexts from Italy to China, from South America to Far Eastern countries, has modified the pleasure of reading. My goal here today is to reflect upon Ferrante's impact in Italy, specifically on the way some contemporary Italian women writers have adopted feminist perspectives and reshaped the Italian middlebrow literary scene in the process. And here referring to the relationship between feminism as a set of ideas in constant evolution and their inclusion into the novels of Italian women writers who have managed to produce pleasurable literature capable of speaking to larger readerships. So can we look at the Italian middlebrow female narrative and observe a concrete liaison with feminism? Is there a relationship between the feminist perspective of these writers and a desire to retrieve and disseminate a historical and cultural memory of feminism? Looking at the state of women's reading in France since the Belle Époque, Diana Holmes notices how the term middlebrow, once accompanied by a status of mediocrity, has become, and I quote here her words, a wide domain composed of all those hybrid novels read by most readers for a usually unexamined mix of reasons. These include the desire to be entertained, the wish to expand one's own knowledge and understanding, the appeal of venturing through simulated experience beyond the confines of the self, end quote. Middlebrow feminist creative works has often led to transmedial projects from one genre into the other, favoring productive collaborations among women within a dimension where the literary work produces rhizomatic, changeable borders, thus reaching a wider audience. This is the case of the Neapolitan novels by Elena Ferrante, adapted into theater plays across Europe. I would just mention the Italian adaptations, the UK, and more recently here in Croatia, where I live, as well as recently reconceived as a graphic novel, which is the third image I'm showing you here, which just came out a couple of weeks ago. Chiara Lagani and Fiorenza Menni of the Fanny and Alexander Theatre Company have given birth to two successful stage adaptations of Ferrante's quartet. And Chiara Lagani has just a month ago published her graphic novel, L'Amica Geniale. Popular feminist novels such as the Neapolitan Quartet have disrupted many certainties concerning the safe separation between high forms of literature studied by the academia and low-level books one can buy in a supermarket, in spite of a system of solidly male academic circles who still likes to bask in condescending attitudes towards women's writing. These monument men of letters, in inverted commas, struggle to understand why Ferrante has had such a great and transversal impact on readers all over the world. and appear to be at odds with a scenario where more and more Italian female writers have become successful while incorporating into their plots feminist ideas and visions. When I speak of feminist ideas in the Italian context, I mostly refer to the inherited thought originally developed during the 70s movements and later developed into the Italian feminism of difference throughout the 80s. These ideas mostly dealt with family relations, abortion and birth control, male violence, women's access to public spheres, but also they provided a radically different ontology of both sex and gender differences, thus opening the space to further developments. There is, I believe, a productive tension between the expectations assigned to feminism as a universe in constant evolution and the centrality of the audience that determines the success of middle-brow literature. In the case of Italy, the global impact of Ferrante has liberated a series of energies that are both domestic and transnational. The authors I will bring here as examples of this phenomenon could help not only to expand the debate inside the horizon established by Ferrante, but also to extend beyond it. So in the first part of this talk, I will examine textual examples of middle-brow Italian women's novels that bring back feminist ideas into the social and cultural arena. These books have received awards, sold hundreds of thousands of copies in Italy, and secured their translation rights in several languages. Here, I limit myself to three possible directions taken by some writers that practice the Italian middle-brow storytelling. Feminist storytelling, the Bildungsroman. So apart from the transmedial experience, which I already mentioned, we have the Bildungsroman conveyed via family or friendship-themed storytelling. We have the rewritings of classical mythology from a gender perspective. And a third phenomenon, which I'm not going to discuss in depth, but which I'll be happy to discuss if there is time, is what I have defined the hybridization of middle-brow feminism, which is the tendency to expand feminist issues through social media narratives. For example, literary criticism on platforms, social and crowd, shared readings, and so on, with the result that readers become an active part in the process of elaboration and dissemination of feminist notions. So I'll mainly focus on the two items marked in red here on my slide. In the second part of my talk, I'll try to problematize the risks of feminist middle-brow marketplace. We may argue whether the very use of feminism, also as an umbrella term, can still be productive to identify certain market tendencies that tend to that aim at emptying somehow or relativizing some of the perceived ideas of feminism itself, thus reducing its capacity for socially transversal changes. Okay, so I would say, although recent strands of fourth wave feminism have proposed the notion that the body can be rewritten, fabricated by joining together different components, desires, and market fads, I would add, several contemporary Italian writers have thematized the body as a symbolic space of reclaimed power and agency. And I think we have seen already this morning several nice examples in this sense. Along with the discourse on motherhood and its less canonical aspects, which of course Elena Ferrante is a main representative, narratives, middle-brow feminist narratives often explore conditions of fragility, trauma, and ambivalences. My first example concerns a case of an episode at the core of Italian historical feminism, masked by a middle-brow coming-of-age novel. And it's the first picture I have here by Viola Ardone, the novel called Oliva Denaro, published in 2021. Just like Ardone's previous Il Treno dei Bambini, the children's train, Oliva Denaro has been sold in several countries, 12 so far, and an English translation by Harper One is on its way. It is a story set between 1961 and 1981, the story of 16-year-old Oliva, who lives in a Sicilian small town with a suffocating mother and an understanding and protective father. Her being a femmina condemns her to a life of restrictions, taboos, and a future that seems already written, without education, without independence. She befriends, however, outspoken Liliana, who likes reading and politics. When Oliva rejects the advances of a sleazy and molesting son of a baker living in her town, he kidnaps and rapes her in the conviction that he can have her as his wife thanks to the Italian law of reparatory marriage. But Oliva doesn't just refuse to marry him, she defends her right to choose her path in life by first reporting him to the police and then facing up to the brutal reality of the trial. The story clearly echoes the ordeal of Franca Viola, a local small-time mafia, Franca Viola, a young Sicilian who in 1965 had been kidnapped and raped by Filippo Melodia, a local small-time mafia criminal. Franca rebelled against the prospect of marrying her perpetrator, and with the support of her family, got Melodia arrested and prosecuted. In Ardone's novel, the body is the site of the protagonist's submission and eventual liberation. Oliva thinks she's ugly and badly made. At the beginning of the novel, we have several occurrences of this. She wishes she were a boy, like her twin brother Cosimo, because her female body is a synonym of fragility and dependence on other people's gaze. As her strict mother keeps telling her, a woman is like a vase, whoever breaks it, buys it. Oliva's gaze is often inspired by her father, who supports her independence, her school education, and teaches her gestures of care and tenderness, without too many words, and for that his wife often tells him that he's not a real man. In many passages of the novel, the insistence on Oliva's changing body is marked by the oscillation between her own gaze and someone else's eyes on her. For example, there is a scene where Liliana takes a picture of her friend from school. Olivia sees herself as pretty for the first time, contrary to what her mother keeps saying. The kidnapping and the sexual violence she's subjected to mark Oliva's crucial transformation, not only in her subjectivity, but also in the context of family balance. Her mother begins to understand and support her traumatized daughter, relinquishing her previous conventional beliefs on well-behaved young girls. Her brother also supports her, while her sister, her older sister, finds the strength of abandoning her own abusive husband. As the whole family suffers isolation and lack of institutional support, feminism spreads in Oliva's life and in the life of her family too, in the form of a consciousness for justice that pushes her to rebel against all those words and behaviors transmitted by her small town world. The encounter with feminist activist Maddalena helps Oliva see that her instinctive choice of refusing a shotgun marriage is legitimate and seals an idea of feminism that exceeds the well-known slogan, "The personal is political." Oliva claims for herself her own experience and the lessons she has learned. And towards the end of the novel, she asks herself, but also her feminist friend Maddalena, why is it hard for us? Why do we need battles, petitions, rallies, burning bras, show our panties, beg to be believed, check the length of skirts, the color of lipstick, the broadness of smiles, the urgency of desires? Every story encompasses a public dimension, so it is significant that the book closes on how Oliva tries and succeeds to overcome her physical and psychological traumas. She becomes a teacher, marries a man who truly loves and respects her, comes back to her hometown, while her friend Liliana becomes a parliament member and succeeds in abrogating the law on shotgun marriage. Ardone reestablishes a clear connection with Italian feminist history, yet she also actualizes it by proposing a story of redemption and liberation that from a local dimension implicates an episode of national history. So it's also a way of rereading history, as we already said this morning. The oscillating of past and present, also sealed by the closeness between father and daughter, with their voices alternating in the last chapters of the novel, makes the microcosm of Oliva Denaro a powerful instrument for a critical self-analysis of feminist conquests in 20th century Italy. My second example here is Giulia Caminito's L'acqua del lago non è mai dolce, The Water of the Lake is Never Sweet, from 2021. It's a book that owes its popularity to a teasing advertising campaign, especially led by the readers, with whom she's regularly in touch through her social media channels. Before the book came out, as you can see on the right-hand side of my slide, the writer published on Facebook the list of the novel's chapters, asking her followers an immediate feedback on the chosen titles and also hinting at fragments of the plot. The enthusiasm and eagerness that this approach aroused were part of the strategic battage that accompanied the book well before it got shortlisted for two of the most prestigious literary awards in Italy, the Strega Prize and the Campiello, which she eventually won. The novel describes the misfortunes of a poor working-class family dominated by a powerful and fierce mother figure, Antonia. However, the real protagonist is the daughter, Gaia, whose voice narrates a story of survival, which recalls some atmospheres of Italian neorealism. By presenting a conflictive mother-daughter bond within a general situation of social unhappiness, the novel centers the plot around Gaia's ungrateful and violent adolescent years during the 80s in a poor provincial town in Lazio, not far from Rome. Gaia became, against all expectations, an attractive character among readers due to her being raw and intense, ferocious even. She faces hardships and tragedies with a hostile and enraged social envy. The very beginning of the novel, there is a very big ego, narrating ego in this novel. And the very beginning, she says something very, very harsh, I would say. I think we're waste materials, meaning we, the low class to which she belongs. Useless cards in a complicated game, chipped marbles that no longer roll. We remained motionless on the ground, like my father, fallen from inadequate scaffolding on an illegal construction site. And from over there, from where we fell, we see others wearing gemstone necklaces. So Gaia's entering adulthood before her time contrasts the dreams of her mother, who would like her daughter to study and become brilliant. Gaia will do all of this, but at great cost, and still not conquer a place in the sun. The idea behind the novel, as writer Veronica Raimo said in a review, is that happiness exists as a form of redemption, yet this is functional to the system that produces material unhappiness. The raw bitterness of the plot has caught very well a widespread feeling of dissatisfaction shared by many Italians of Caminito's generation. The writer was born in 1988. The element of class inequality is a powerful tool that captures readers who today live precarious and uncertain situations, especially after the 2008 crisis and the 2020 pandemic. This generalized sense of loss is coupled with the absence of strong ideologies and political references, as well as with a language that is at the same time cascade-like, evocative and provocative. Although Caminito's reception has not been directly attached to an openly feminist agenda, the description of Gaia's misadventures makes her marginality, which is primarily one of class, also a gendered one. The book is, among other things, an experimental stream of consciousness where the main preoccupation seems to be the subversion of all those traditionally positive female characteristics attached to a heroine. Like Ardone, Caminito constructs a strong female-centered Bildung where mother and daughter rarely find how to fine-tune on each other's lives. Unlike Ardone, Caminito doesn't give any credit to female alliances. Gaia's female friendships are fragile, contradictory, and frustrating. The only close friend who may become an ally dies and leaves her lonelier than before. All of this makes the novel seem a sort of unfinished experiment with the Bildungsroman genre. Gaia knows she will never be as heroic as her mother, yet she detests her for being a direct reflection of the low social class to which the entire family is relegated. The whole process of Gaia's self-education through apparent success and actual self-sabotage marks the story as one where relationships fail to become what they could potentially become. It questions the reliability of intergenerational relations, the very symbolic fabric of what could hold mother and daughter together, yet is crushed by something too devastating and prevailing. In a way, Caminito seems to echo Ferrante's recent statement in her latest essay In the Margins on the Pleasures of Reading and Writing, where she's discussing her novels and saying, I muted the idea that I had to describe an out there, arranged in a narrative order, and had the duty to record it on the great scroll of realistic literature. Instead, I dipped into the warehouse of literary expression, taking out what I needed without indicating boundaries between high and low. In describing the gap between social expectations of a still too patriarchal society and the hardships of a young woman living in a poor Italian province, Caminito's novel moves towards the direction of an engaged middle brow that depicts Ferrante's out there, the real life through which an author wishes to intercept the troubles and the worries of a generation. Okay, so my third angle, the third angle from which I'm looking at Italian feminist middle brow is the rewriting of myths. So in a way, I'm bringing you one example first before I talk about Marilu Oliva, which is my third author. This is Mitiche. Mitiche is by Giulia Caminito, is a book conceived, published in 2020, book conceived for a teenage audience from where Greek classical heroines are retold not by focusing on the presence of the divine, I quote from the preface, on their husbands, on the wars, but rather by telling their thoughts, their fears and anxieties, their desires. Caminito, however, throughout the text maintains a third-person narration when reconstructing the lives of Medea, Penelope, or Ariadne. And you can see also that there was a theater adaptation of her Mitiche called Pandora, Don't Open That Vase, Pandora, Non Aprire Quel Vaso, which was pretty successful. An wholly female theater company organized that at the Teatro Cuminetti in Trento. So while Caminito maintains the third-person narration when reconstructing the lives of mythical women, teacher, blogger, and writer Marilu Oliva, born in the mid-70s, wrote a book called L'Odissea raccontata da Penelope, Circe, Calypso e le altre, where she gives mythological women the space to tell their story in the first person. Marilu Oliva reestablishes a connection with previous feminist rewritings of Homeric mythologies, making herself part of a rich and composite tradition that includes Margaret Atwood, Angela Carter, Madeline Miller, and I think thanks to Sandra later during the conference, we'll hear beautiful observations about this topic. Although Oliva has stated that she never wished to retrieve a feminist odyssey, the narrative focus on the female gazes of the story sheds a new light on the value of women's cultural memory, which enriches the classical myth standing at the core of Western literature. The invitation to women launched by Adrienne Rich in 1972 to consider feminist literary revisions as a form of creative reappropriation of male traditions finds an echo in much of Oliva's project. Her heroines are wise protagonists of Western and Mediterranean literary canons. Their experiences become filled with gender significance by being granted a dimension that restores female memory by also assigning a new agency to sexual difference. Furthermore, in this Odyssea, each heroine's voice adds a segment to a captivating polyphony of stories that take away from Odysseus his unique role as the sole protagonist and expand the dialogic and multi-layered nature of myth. I have two instances of Oliva's reinvention. One is where she tells Nausicaa, who is, unlike in the original poem, very empathic towards the hero, but also at some point audaciously goes upstairs to her bedroom in order to acquire a superior view on everything that happens in the royal hall where her father is listening to Odysseus. The second example is when Penelope, unlike the original Odyssey, is present at the massacre of her vulgar and violent suitors, so the description of the vengeance is told through her perspective. And in the original, we remind you, she sleeps in her chambers while her husband executes the suitors. Moreover, there is another, I would say, hidden palimpsest that shows the inherent transmedial nature of the epic tale. The order in which each female voice in Oliva's narrative tells her piece of story is the same order as that of a famous TV miniseries dedicated back in 1968 to the Odyssey's journey, directed by Franco Rossi and featuring Bekim Femio as Odysseus and Irene Papas as Penelope. By unintentionally connecting something of a shared transmedial cultural memory, Oliva has actively retrieved the female protagonist, just like the TV screenplay had done almost more than 50 years ago. By multiplying the diegetic perspectives, she effectively reproduced women's active agency in the transmission of the Homeric myth for present and future generations of readers. This is another quick example. I was briefly mentioning it before to Sandra. This is the latest book by Marilu Oliva about Dido's Aeneid, where she also introduces the theme of sisterhood between goddesses and Dido, and because she chose to intertwine their voices. So there's another example which would be interesting to look at. In the wake of Ferrante, other women authored novels published in Italy over the past few years provide genuine and powerful forms of storytelling that strongly call for a return to a complex, material, and involving realism. At the same time, their success in terms of sales and visibility has consolidated their status as skillful page turners, providing at once plots that are both engaging and engaged. As Diana Holmes writes, middlebrow novels satisfy a human, it would seem particularly feminine, desire for stories, and at the same time, a thirst for knowledge and self-development. Along with these elements, I would suggest that the text I have briefly presented can be considered successful middlebrow feminist novels because they share some of these characteristics. An insistence on materialism with references to bodily and psychological painful situations, conflicts and traumas that often interconnect private and collective dimensions. This, I would say, creates a refraction into the reader's lives and triggers strong mechanism of identification. Second element, I would say, is the immersive construction of a poetics of place, which in Italy often coincides with the regional environment, along with the wide presence of sensorial elements that make the contact with these texts fluid and appealing. Third element would be the central strong female figures that experience forms of struggle and engage in various forms of resistance, epitomizing personal and social changes. This galvanizes, especially female readers, living in a contemporary time still fraught with gender violence and discriminations. And finally, I would mention, because of my own personal experience as a translator, the translatability of these texts, the fact that they have an impact on international audiences, thus expanding the scope of their plots, their voices, and their contexts. So now in my second and last part, I will discuss female readership and marketplace feminism in Italy. So the need for greater visibility, Monica earlier today mentioned a book that was seminal to me as well, which is Mad Woman in the Attic, where the visibility of women's writing was introduced the well-known refrain of feminist literary criticism. So at least its publication in 1979. In the 80s, Italian cultural and academic circles became increasingly aware of the existence of a line of foremothers historically neglected by literary chronicles. This went hand in hand with the growth of women's libraries and bookshops, as well as feminist literary societies throughout the 80s and 90s. However, none of these phenomena ever reached mass readership, resulting in self-ghettoization of those circles. Things are quite different today. Among the main agents of the discovery and dissemination of women's literature is the Società Italiana delle Letterate, Italian Society of Women of Letters, which has now existed for over 25 years, along with important cultural associations and magazines such as Leggendaria and Letterate magazine, which is purely exclusively online. Both the Società delle Letterate and the Italian book fair called Feminism, which just finished its 3-month-long series of sessions and events, and which was inaugurated in 2018, these represent formidable observatories of all the tendencies in women's literature in Italy, by giving attention to past writers as well as to newer authors, both established and upcoming. As early as 2005, British author Ian McEwan was laconically declaring that when women stop reading, the novel will be dead. The global success of female narratives during and after the Elena Ferrante and the Ferrante fever has changed forever the face of the market, as well as affecting how publishers and audience perceive women writers. Ferrante has shifted the attention towards a form of female immersive storytelling imbued with political issues that, while specifically addressing women, talk to everyone. Parallel to this, as shown by several recent studies, the novel is the genre that is currently produced and purchased in increasingly higher quantities compared to other genres. This leads it to be more and more conceived with a marketing logic driven by sales. From this point of view, according to critic and scholar Matteo Mocca, and to many other observers, Italian novels risk to lose fulfilling a social role and, above all, having a political value. This also becomes the mirror of a society in which their hierarchical scale between high and low is gradually replaced by a horizontal approach. In today's digitalized society, the term visibility becomes slippery, dangerously close to an economy based on being seen, no matter how and what is seen, because the idea, whichever idea it may be, can be sold as a product. One interesting phenomenon concerns literature written by women ideally addressed to young girls, which is advertised through ad hoc campaigns on widely read Italian newspapers like Repubblica or Corriere della Sera. Already in 2017, a commentator in Corriere della Sera was noticing a different trend in the sales of books written by women. He was referring to the success stories such as the one of Storie della Buonanotte per Bambine Ribelli, Good Night Stories for Rebel Girls, published in 2016 by Francesca Cavallo and Elena Cavilli, a huge project originated from a crowdfunding that earned the authors over $1 million collected from 70 different countries. But let's look at the lesser happy aspects of this. So to what extent are women writers read and reviewed in Italy? According to data from the Observatory on Women and Men in Publishing, with data started to be collected in 2018, 24% fewer female writers are reviewed than male writers. And female cultural journalists publish 30% less than their male counterparts. In particular, out of the total number of reviews, 64 women writers are reviewed against 107 male authors. And the authors of the reviewers are 35% female and 65% male. Women are mainly reviewed by women, but only in 57.6%, while the male writers, they review everyone. And 79%, they prefer to review male narratives. Diana Holmes legitimately, I would say, asks and observes, does it matter if critics patronize and marginalize women writers, since readers seem to simply ignore them, and thanks to new media, now have the public forums in which to express alternative views? The problem is that critical silence makes it particularly difficult for a woman author to aspire to both literary recognition and a wide readership, which is surely a legitimate goal for any writer. This echoes to the somewhat schizophrenic situation in Italy, where on the one hand, women writers emerge as powerful, exposed economic actors of the cultural industry, in as much as they are acquired as pure products, whereas on the other hand, the citadel of highbrow readers, academics, literary critics, and reviewers, treat them with condescendence, sometimes openly placing them on the level of mainstream chick lit books a la Bridget Jones. Let's not forget that, as I hope to have partly shown in my previous analysis, the issues thematized by successful Italian women writers are what makes the real difference in the dissemination of a feminist awareness among readers. So what can impede and frustrate the change in ourselves, in relationships and in identities? What can hinder what Professor Jill Rai called the reading dialogue, permitted by a collective feminist endeavor where critics, writers, and as well as readers would be equally involved in a dynamic and continuous path of self-recognition and open possibilities? Problems may arise, I would say, from the commodification of feminism, something which is the object of Andy Zeisler's beautiful book, We Were Feminists Once, where she argues for a notion of marketplace feminism and criticizes its transformation into a pop and depoliticized epiphenomenon. So this mass-oriented tendency to blur the importance for mothers and their struggles in favor of a solely market-driven perspective where texts exhibiting supposedly feminist plots are in fact suggesting models of neo-capitalist self-made individual behavior. Such directions in the production, circulation, and reception of feminist ideas may become part of a mechanism entirely focused on the satisfaction of induced consumeristic desires. I see there a great risk that the conquest of feminism may be lost, as well as a risk that intergenerational and transnational scholarship dedicated to women writers and their readerships may not survive. The spreading of marketplace feminism through the main cultural debate, especially through social media, has provoked the insurgence of improvised academic feminist careers, whereby scholars who so far had never engaged in readings of bell hooks, Elena Ferrante, or Adriana Cavarero, do so in order to acquire visibility, to reestablish powerful connections, to seal their own positions. I suggest 3 key words to reconfigure and better understand, at least partly, what is going on in middle-brow Italian literature by women and how to contrast the bad effects of feminist marketplace. These words are genealogy, transnationalism, and relationality. I would venture to say that feminism could benefit if we, the critics, pursued these 3 aspects in our work. With genealogy, I mean the fact that writers more and more seek for a renewed relationship with feminist authors and intellectuals from previous generations. So they write introductions to their republished novels, they edit anthologies, they actively work with publishing houses which promote women's literature, they directly create a dialogue with fellow writers who experienced feminism, so looking at previous generations. Transnationalism is what we were discussing earlier, and this morning too. Translation and market are 2 axes along which feminist middle-brow literature is taking its bravest steps. The successful efforts of contemporary women writers to make their work visible in other languages have broken the spell of a women's literature known and discussed solely inside academic circles. The scholarship on Ferrante and her readership have proved that this is the case in spite of media attacks, circumscribed as they may be, or hostile highbrow environments. So today writers promote themselves whenever they get translated and interact with readers from other countries, especially through social media, which provide the first and main crucial tool to convey feminist ideas and immersive desires among readers. I would also mention in particular the fact that women writers actively use social digital communication to interact with school and university students who are keen on listening to what these writers have to say rather than merely reading their books. And finally, relationality. Some contemporary Italian women writers with a feminist consciousness tend to create alliances, just like feminist scholars do inside and outside academia. The Società Italiana delle Letterate is an early example of this trend. In fact, it may have set the trend of establishing cooperation that would engender creative literary projects. As a lateral example, my own relationality with other Ferrante scholars, Tiziana De Rogatis, Tiliana Milkova, Adalgisa Giorgio, Enrica Ferrara, Katrin Velin Giorgi, and many more, on a continuous exchange that feeds on each one's experience and specific interests and background. So to conclude, the readers of female author texts that turn into international market success are no longer solely literature specialists, as shown by global novels bearing strong feminist messages. Suffice it to mention here Margaret Atwood, Elizabeth Strout, or Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. These books talk to women and men thanks to the circulation of translations. It is actually the scholars who have now modified, or should modify, their gaze in order to capture how society is being transformed by the words, the images, and the situations with which these writers imbue our complex, interconnected reality. In response to the sociological emptying out of feminism in media culture, many Italian narratives react by moving in various directions and repropose materialism, familiarity with living matter, thus going partly against the parameters indicated by Anglo-American feminism, increasingly focused on social constructivism and on binary logic. The materiality of women's experiences are central elements of the feminism of difference, specifically European feminism, to which Italian women writers owe a lot in terms of symbolic reinvention. A middle-brow literature that incorporates feminist issues in itself thus revitalizes the materiality of bodies and the experiences related to them. In this moment of advanced capitalism in which matter becomes more and more a bargaining good mediated by technologies. Within a multilingual dimension, Italian feminist literary criticism may find the necessary impetus to watch over any drift of feminist marketing. So middle brow can become an effective strategy to repropose and relaunch feminist ideas. And in La Frantumaglia, Ferrante says, I renounce nothing that can give pleasure to the reader, not even what is considered old, trite, vulgar, not even the devices of genre fiction. If a novel has that, it needs nothing else. It can continue on its way, drawing its readers along, even if necessary, into its opposite, the anti-novel. So the central core of literary feminism resides, I believe, in continuously learning how to talk about margins, challenges, traumas, processes of losing and regaining. If these aspects become instrumental to market mechanisms to the point of becoming impossible to control them, the potential for reversal, the potential for change, so reading for change, will be emptied from the inside. In addition to the excessive and obvious visibility, the feminist novel should also be able to escape the mechanism of totalizing communication that covers and interprets everything, filling words with meanings based on trends. There should remain a noyau dur of unspoken stories that cannot be absorbed by oversimplified social media products. And I thank you.
Thank you, Serena, for a very dense presentation, which has ranged between so many aspects of the situation, between themes, genre conventions, ideas that underpin these narratives, relationships with the economic and market forces, social media, the implication of all of these elements for literary criticism and for telling us what our role should be or could be from now on. So I would like now to open the floor to questions. So are there any questions? Please do put your questions in the chat or raise your hand. Daria. And Daria Forlenza has a question.
Thank you, Adalgisa. Thank you, Serena, for your speech because it was beautiful, and thank you for giving an insight of a lot of questions that are and issues that are really important. First of all, I would like to ask you if you could speak about the term hybridization in relation to the Ferrante case. Do you think that this Ferrante's novel obtained mass appeal because it's easier? It's a novel that can be can affect a readership. Why it's important that this novel has had this kind of hybridization. You also spoke about the idea that no feminist is an island, and I was thinking of this sentence, and I was thinking, so because you conclude your speech with the idea of interaction and to give more attention to margins. And so, in your opinion, what is marginality, and what do you think one can do to give more attention to this kind of reality, marginality? I think there are more than one question, but if you want that I explain better the questions, you can tell me. Thank you.
I think I understood the 2-3 main points that you're making here, and I thank you so much, because they raise a lot of important meditations, I would say. I mean, it's such a, we're at the crossroads between textual analysis, but textual analysis brings us, of course, to sociology of literature here. So the issue of the margins is crucial, but the issue of the margins as represented by Elena Ferrante, I believe, became so successful because not only did it give birth to emotional, not just cognitive responses. I'm here quoting a beautiful talk that Diana Holmes gave yesterday, actually, in Strasbourg. So the emotional response was present there because it was talking, of course, a little bit like what other writers did eventually, like the same Giulia Caminito, to a wide range of social classes, a wide range of situations, discussing, for example, the internal migration between South and North of Italy, discussing the access to education by girls from lower classes, and of course, the fact that we all have to somehow cope with pervasive patriarchal violence. So these were all channels through which the success became solid, it became guaranteed, and became prolonged throughout time, which is why we still want to watch on HBO My Brilliant Friend, even though we have watched it several times. I mean, that happens to me. I see it on HBO and I just, okay, I'll watch it again. But the fact is that she's not creating an identity politics out of those margins. She's possibly triggering different kinds of reactions that exceed the tendency to make of feminism a sort of arena where the identity is being defended against the stronghold of patriarchy. I think she did something that exceeds that complicates that even. So probably the consequences of this success can be seen on the hybridization of the communication of these topics in social media, because there is the identification mechanism, which is very visible in the transmedial adaptations of Elena Ferrante. But you also have the fact that these stories are unique. They're close to us, but they're also unique. They're artistically unique. They're paying a large tribute to previous generations of women in Italy and outside of Italy who have fought and struggled to obtain what we today obtain, what we have obtained in spite of constant backlashes. The hybridization of the media is something else. I was briefly referring to the way that there is a emotivism in social media. When you like a book, you put a lot of emojis, you comment a lot, you write a lot of emotional involved sentences. That can turn the book into a product. a product of success. But that doesn't exhaust the potential of the book to talk to generations of readers, which are transversal. So I believe that if we stop at seeing the immediate emotional response pervaded as it is throughout the social media, so through alternative channels that are not the main channels of publishing industry, then we lose something. We should try to see beyond the mere product placement of these stories. I don't know if I have answered though, so please correct me if I blurred too much.
Okay, it looks as if Daria is satisfied.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Serena.
Okay, and we have another question from, forgive me if I don't pronounce your name correctly, Metka Tsupancic.
Perfect. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
I'm really glad that somebody mentioned your conference. A friend sent me the link and I made sure that I registered. I'm a French scholar. I worked in Alabama and I'm back in Slovenia right now. And I still work in feminist literature and research. And I'm really very, very glad that I heard your talk, the keynote, because it brought together a lot of things that I'm interested in. I read Ferrante in Italian, all the 4 books and other books, and so that was my, going back to Italian. I would say, to respond to your middlebrowish comment, I think that the contemporary literature by women and by men, for that matter, is very much middlebrowish in general. I think that it's a sign of something that's going on, and I would like you to comment upon it, of course. It's a sign of that, the being fed up with the exploratory literature. I wrote my dissertation on Claude Simon, and I translated him, and the longest sentence in one of his books, Les Géorgiques, is 17 pages long sentence. So, that's the highbrowish literature. And then I did write a book on Hélène Cixous, and I continue working on her, and that's highbrowish in many ways, of course. But I think that there's the need, in order to achieve what you quoted in terms of Ferrante, to achieve that access to the communication, to the sorority, as we called it in a number of publications that we made together. The sorority can be achieved, and those medical patterns can be changed, remodeled, if we work together, if we develop the collective consciousness. And I think that, middlebrowishness is a very good term, and it is, to me, an appropriate way to reach a larger audience. And then, of course, we can put aside the commercial aspects of literature. But as long as there is something that's happening, and I think that every story carries archetypes, and that every story will rewrite the archetypes in a new way, if possible, that will then change the readership. I would really very much like to have your reaction to it.
Thank you, Falati, Metka. I know you work. I know you work on Cixous, so it's a pleasure to meet
thank you so much.
Virtually. I live and work in Zagreb, so
wow.
I'm thinking of what Elena Ferrante says when she uses the word urti here. The hits, the fact of bumping into something. Why am I thinking of that? Because it is true that everything is pervasively becoming middlebrowish, and it is true that in order to construct this relationality, this commonality, and this sorority that you mentioned, it is useful to keep both our eyes open on what is going on in the world, in the market, and throughout different layers of society. But it is also true that I think she achieved both levels, and very few writers are doing that because they have an eye only or most exclusively at the market. She achieved both levels because there is a strong connection with a genealogy of women who preceded her. So the gaze at history and the gaze at feminist history especially allowed her to be, first of all, a great reader of feminist texts. And then through those readings, she was able to pour in all the knowledge and the notions and to actually manipulate them, but it's such an artistic and creative way that you don't mind that. You don't mind that she's so very much intertextual in her reading and writing and rephrasing and translating and adapting of other women's words. So in that sense, she still teaches the middle brow, or supposedly so, audience to be a little bit less middle brow, because she kind of raises their expectations, but also gives them the urti, the bumps that solicit and stimulate and actually create a problematization of the topics that she's putting on in the arena of her narratives. I don't think that every single writer who inspires him or herself to feminist principles is able to do the same, but because it's simply there are other options and that there are other objectives. And of course, we have to face the fact that this is part of an industry. So once it's part of an industry, and as you correctly said at the beginning of your observation, we are now in a capitalist situation where, of course, everything can be commodified, everything can become a product. So I think that the expansion of her, the range of her experience as a narrator and the range of her proposal as a narrator and as a thinker can be always a source of surprise, of discovery, precisely because there is this interaction between past and present, between the languages, between the translations, between the deterritorialization of the nation, of course, because she is a global author. So, of course, there's no claiming of any national tradition only there. National tradition is very porous in Ferrante, so that allows Italian language to also to be something else, something that modernist writers probably did not imagine. So it's a beautiful and fascinating topic what you're raising. So thank you. I hope I answered partly.
Well, absolutely. I would just add that when McCowan talks about women reading and when they will stop reading their women literature, you know, but who wrote the stories for women? Flaubert. And going back to mythology, you know, who wrote the myth about women? And that's yet another story, right? Thank you so much, Serena. And
Może, absolutno.
Thank you very much, Metka. Other questions from the floor? No? Well, then I'll ask one. Serena, I'm interested in if you could expand a bit the issue of hunger for reality, and also, also realism, obviously, which is connected to that, in relation to the fact that some of these novels, this new trend, are heavily, let's say, accented in the sense that they refer to a regional, and I'm using the word in a non, negative, without a negative connotation, in a regional context, which is strong in patriarchal, maybe, arrangements, or like the south of Italy, or political, a strongly politicized or needing politicization, context of this kind, like Naples, like Sicily. And among the novels that you have outlined today, I can see how Ardone's work is strongly connoted with regional references and political references, both Il Treno dei Bambini and Oliva Denaro and other novels that I have read. Similarly, Ferrante, obviously, we have again a strongly Neapolitan setting, but Caminito's story is very much lacking in depth and spessore, as we say in Italian, as it comes to setting. So how do you think these differences play out in terms of success, transnationality? How are they relevant? Is it relevant that some of them glide over the political, economic aspects that create those the reality in which the characters live and react to, like Gaia in Caminito? I wonder whether that is an important aspect or in any way relevant.
I think it's a crucial aspect. Thank you so much for the question, on which I will have to reflect furthermore, because we've been talking about these things for many times, but still there are things that need to be analyzed in depth. I would say that, first of all, there is a generational difference in terms of how much memory of feminist struggles, for example, is present in Caminito's poetics, and how much of that memory can be featured and can become recognizable in Ardone or Marilu Oliva's, for example, work. I think the crucial transition between the 80s and the 90s in Italy was a breaking point, because with that, the excesses of the 80s, and I'm talking about the 80s excess in terms of economic yuppism and economic expectations and growth of apparent economic growth and apparent growth in terms of professional possibilities for young people, that suddenly came to a stop in the early 90s with the crisis of 1992, with the socio-political decay in every social layer of our country. And so I think that Caminito somehow, even though maybe not consciously, expresses that in form of trauma, in terms of absence of that regional references, in terms of linguistic reference even, because possibly that's not the kind of food that was on our table any longer. It's something that already belongs to a slightly earlier generation of women in Italy, of women who went to school in the 90s. I'm from 1980. Giulia Caminito is from 1988. And I can already sense that there is a slight difference in terms of cultural references and linguistic references to what we have been exposed, to which we have been exposed. That lack of depth and spessore in her writing, I think also responds to a more liquid, Bauman would say, society, sort of society where even the most basic geographical and social and cultural references have been lost, because there was a huge crisis in Italian school system when Caminito was studying, I don't know, in high school. The references coming from publishing houses and the kind of books that were translated in the early 90s and in the mid 90s, of course, nourished and influenced her in a much different way than what Ardone, Marilu Oliva, or the same Elena Ferrante might have been exposed to. So I think that we're talking here, we could say that there is a biographical fracture between these authors. The regional reference is still important in the market. I'm not afraid of spelling out this word, but because it's still what is being asked. When I was studying Sicilian historical fiction in the 90s until the mid 2000s, I talked to a lot of editors and publishers, even quite important, like people from Einaudi and Mondadori. And it became very clear that once La Lunga Vita di Marianna Ucria by Dacia Maraini came out in the 90s, the regional reference became somehow a guarantee of success and sales for women writers altogether. So the presence of regional influence and the fact that women could reread regional literature, reading against the grain of Sciascia, Tomasi di Lampedusa, or I don't know, Domenico Rea for Campania and Naples, that was a guarantee of success and of sales. And that became sort of a label put on every woman who was writing from those regions. And the more dialectal they were, the more they were encouraged to insist on that aspect. So also the regional, of course, with the success of Andrea Camilleri, the regional aspect of Italian literature and Italian historical fiction became crucial. But it slipped away when it came to women writers from the second part of the 2000s onwards, because it also became sort of a liquid reference. Now, every region sort of resembles any other region. So it is difficult to go back unless you have a safe space like the one created by Ferrante, which is not a safe space at all, because it problematizes deeply the space of Naples and the space of the Rione from different perspectives. But one has to read through the different layers, I would say, before trying to apply those labels that might have been useful for writers born in the 70s could not be enough. We probably have to look beyond that. I don't know if I have answered.
Yes, it's very interesting. And I could respond now in terms of, because we could talk about this for years probably, but I'll first of all go around again the participants in the room. Is there anybody? Sandra.
Thank you so much, Serena. That was absolutely fantastic. I've taken pages of notes, and I'm just writing notes from the Q&A now, and hoping that I can at one point read these novels. I've got two small questions, if possible. So that you sort of that list of the kind of the four things that characterize the novels that you've been talking about, and I was just wondering, how does the poetics of place relate to translatability? Because sometimes you might think that they could be counterintuitive, right? That a specific poetics of place might be more difficult to translate, say, into Romanian, into English, into French, etc. So what's the relationship between those two? And then the second one is linked, I guess this one's linked to what you were discussing with Adalgisa, but also, sort of thinking about some of these novels not tackling necessarily, social or political or economic issues. Do you think that might be a sort of a conscious choice in the sense that, well, we don't want to, or, like just because I'm writing as a woman, I don't necessarily have to deal with every single issue that links, that sort of partakes to women's lives. I don't have to be that representative. Do you see that? So is there a sort of, it's not my job to necessarily fit, to kind of sort all of these issues out as, thinking about the women writers here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandra, for these inspiring questions. Again, there would be hours of discussions here. I don't even know where to start. But as for your first question, the connection between poetics of place and translatability, I would say that the digital world made a huge difference in terms also of the pleasure of reading and the pleasure of writing about places that one wants to make more accessible. Because I personally think the translatability of authors that I've been working on was allowed by the huge factor of spreading on the web pictures of those places and basically thematizing. I don't know, I'm thinking of the Strait of Messina because I work a lot on Nadia Terranova, and being from Messina myself, that pushed me towards that direction of rethinking in critical terms the space where I was born and where I was growing up. So yeah, the presence of digitalization, of digital communication could be a central axe of that allows translatability to be carried on by a poetics of place that thinks of a local but looks at the global, if you want a sort of a slogan there. And of course, the adaptations there play a huge role too, because adaptations, transmedial adaptations, and I'm thinking about the tendency, for example, of writers, women writers in Italy to endeavor in graphic novels, which is something that is quite recently as a phenomenon, but also affects, of course, the visual imagery of readers. And in that way, it translates, if you want, in a much immediate and unmediated way towards potential foreign readers. So I think those would be two possible ways of looking at that. Oh yeah, the second question was about the political engagement, whether women writers feel the need to create that écart, to distance themselves from the topics. Of course, being a woman and being a writer in Italy has to deal with all sorts of material difficulties. But as I was trying to say in my talk, there's no such a thing as a women writer who programmatically, okay, you have to be intellectually honest, of course, but programmatically that will say, I will deal with this topic because I know that it's a topic that sells. But you see the effects of that. On the other hand, when you have women writers who objectively steer away from those topics in order to deal with something more intimate, or even with something that only male writers have dealt with so far, then if possible, maybe I'm biased, but if possible, those are even more feminist texts, because once you tackle the canonical tradition, and once you try to rewrite, to put your voice in the arena in terms of genre, in terms of linguistic choices, in terms of syntax, then it becomes an experiment worth reading, just because of the fact that particular narrator has succeeded so far putting out there her story, her experience, her way of shaping the world. So there's always something political, I would say. But I'm particularly thinking of the Italian publishing industry here, which is it's filled with obstacles for women. So
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. There is a question from Emily Billman, which is addressed to me. I presume that Emily would like to know what I think, or my response to Serena's answer to my question. But maybe we can do this on a separate occasion, because I would like to leave space for questions for our speaker. If you don't mind, Emily, we could have a chat ourselves at some point. I'd like to ask, first of all, what if there are any more questions on the paper, on Serena's paper. Any questions? Okay. If there aren't any, I do have another question for Serena, and then we'll see at the end if there is time for me to say something. At one point, Serena, I've lost Serena. Are you there? I don't see her on the screen. Okay. You say that this might be a literature for young people. And this is something that struck me, that even a lot of this literature has young adolescents or even children as protagonists, and they are Bildungsroman of young people who then reach adulthood. And while I also noticed there's a few of these writers I have been reading, apart from Ardone, but also other Neapolitan writers I've read recently who write in the same vein, are teachers. And is there a link, in your opinion, and the fact that this could be a literature for young people, and is affected by the fact that these people these authors see young people, their privileged or preferred audience, exactly to obtain that change that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. Viola Ardone teaches in high school.
Yeah.
So, and Marilu Oliva is a teacher who recently published, Marilu Oliva recently published a book written with her son about, it's a book that narrativizes and thematizes bullying in schools through the experience of her son's friend. Which I found very interesting, for example, to counter the violence that we see more and more featured in our daily chronicles. So definitely, yes, the fact that young people have not been are no longer just identified as a publishing target, let's say, as potential buyers, or their parents, of course, who buy books for them, but also as featured characters in stories. I think beautifully connects with many of our best authors in the Italian Novecento, because the perspective of a young girl in a novel, and the fact that you can see through the novel growing up this young girl into a young woman, which is what we, of course, witness in Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan Quartet. But not only that, I'm thinking of, I don't know, Natalia Ginsburg or Elsa Morante. I mean, the great authors that marked the tradition on which some of these writers openly, to which most of the writers openly refer to. The fact that they're teachers, yes. And I think it's, that would be a topic to be further explored, also in relation to the fact that Italian literature, through the epitomization of education and access to school, and the fact that generations talk to each other, those elements make Italian literature even more translatable abroad. Because in my opinion, when you are able to look at society through the school system and how the school system reacts to changes among young generations, then you have partly won your battle already, because that means that you are able to descend from high to low, if you want, to put yourself under their skin, to tell things through their experience, but also to create a dialogue with potential younger readers. There is, for example, another, I think, beautiful tendency in Italian publishing industry, mostly written by women, which is scientists who write books for younger girls. And these books are very often adopted in schools. They're used in schools as collateral materials that integrate normal programs. And this you can see very clearly at the feminist book fair I mentioned earlier, Feminism, organized by the Società delle Letterate. There are stands, entire selling points of books solely dedicated, I don't know, to female paleontology, female archaeology, and women in science in general. I think that is precisely what is going on. I think that means that they're no longer seen as a target, as a market target, but also as interlocutors for implementing some changes in society.
If there are no questions, I would like just to make one little tangential, or probably it's a very important question about among young people and the fact that, you know, these new social shared forms of reading, which are primarily done online, like book groups and other forms of shared reading experiences. So how does this link to what you were just telling us about young people, not so much any longer as targets for the market, but as protagonists, but actually as readers now? Do we have a kind of phenomenology also of reading?
I would say yes, because there are studies that testify, studies written by librarians and academic scholars equally, sometimes collaborating with each other. For example, some schools in Rome and central Italy or in Bologna have done very interesting experiments in crowd and social reading. So when, for example, you have a book group that's been held on a platform, what happens is that there is this unprecedented reading mode where readers directly interact with the authors, or, for example, they receive teasers about the next book coming out and want to know more, or ask questions, or express more often their own personal opinions on what they've just read. A little bit like Anobi, what Anobi does and what other similar websites do. So once the reading becomes part of a shared experience, there are two possible effects. One, I would say, quite dangerous, and one extremely positive. The risk, which I see as a risk, but if contained, that doesn't have to be necessarily one dangerous thing, is that there is more and more the phenomenon of emotional social reading, where this emotional social reading actually looks more at the personal identity of the reader and personal responses of the reader, rather than at creating an interaction with what is actually being read. So there is a shift of the focus from the text, from what the text creates in terms of reactions, to the reaction itself. And there are people discussing and even fighting with each other about whether a book has been, what has been giving them, what has it represented for them, because there is also this discourse of representation, what it tells to me, what I feel. No, so the emotivism that runs wild through social media can be a source of a misshapen disseminations of these books. The positive aspect, of course, is that the circulation of books through social and crowd reading annuls the physical and the symbolic distances and the class differences, and contributes to all the good that middlebrow represents. So in a way, of course, enhances the access to practices of reading and writing, also from people who maybe never picked up a book in their life. And of course, it stimulates the social aspect of reading, stimulates the fact that reading actually changes your life, that it changes your habits, that it changes your imagery, and creates, of course, beautiful but also risky mechanisms of identification with what you have read. We will hear tomorrow from Marie-Elise and Francesca, for example, about Margaret Atwood. Margaret Atwood is a very interesting epiphenomenon, and what the phenomenon of Handmaid's Tale and the HBO adaptation has done in Italy. I'm thinking of the positive effects that this book and the series had on the discussions and the restrictions on abortions, for example. Now that's the purely political and purely sociological positive aspects being finally visible to all. And I think that's very, very interesting. And Margaret Atwood's books are now being discussed in many different sorts of book clubs, crowd and shared readings. And there are dozens of Italian fan page, Facebook, Instagram. So it is quite a phenomenon. So I think it's worth further meditating on this.
I think we are over our time. It's 4 minutes past 3. So it's been a wonderful session, and I am sure that many of these aspects can return, and we can come back to them throughout the end of today and tomorrow. And especially Emily, I'm sorry I didn't reply to that, but I'm sure there will be an opportunity sometimes between today and tomorrow to come back to that, and I will keep that in mind and see whether I can fit an answer somewhere for you. Okay, so we stop now, and there is a break of now 10 minutes, and we'll see, go and have a break for 10 minutes, and we'll be back here. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Serena, for a wonderful talk and discussion.